The year was 1944, and the world was hanging by threads of smoke and steel. Europe burned from end to end, and the sky itself had become a battlefield. Pilots called it the Iron Storm. Up there, thousands of feet above shattered towns and frozen rivers, a new terror appeared. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the first jet fighter in history. It was sleek, silver, and impossibly fast, slicing through bomber formations like a blade through paper. Allied pilots in their P-51 Mustangs, proud guardians of the bombers, suddenly found themselves helpless. Their engines roared, their guns blazed, but the German jets simply vanished into the clouds, leaving nothing but trails of flame and humiliation. On the ground, beneath that endless gray sky, one man refused to accept it. His name was Sergeant Ernie Hollis, a mechanic stationed on a muddy airfield in England. He wasn't famous, not an ace or a hero, just a tired man with oil-stained hands and a stubborn belief that machines had souls. He'd seen too many pilots die, too many engines fail, and he knew that the Mustang still had more to give. Late at night, under the flickering light of a single lantern, he began to tinker with something forbidden, the throttle governor of the Merlin P-1650 engine. It was supposed to limit how much boost a pilot could use, a safeguard to prevent the engine from destroying itself. But Hollis didn't believe in limits. He believed in survival. What he found was a secret buried inside the machine, a kind of mechanical heartbeat waiting to be unchained. By loosening one screw and adjusting the fuel mixture, he gave the Merlin the ability to roar beyond its rated power. It was a dangerous trick, one that could melt pistons, crack valves, or tear the engine apart in seconds. But it also unleashed a burst of raw power unlike anything the pilots had ever felt. They said it was like riding a thunderstorm, like the plane had been holding its breath all along and suddenly decided to scream. Command forbade it. Manuals didn't mention it. No report ever admitted it happened. But word spread like wildfire across the airfields of the 8th Air Force. Pilots whispered the secret in mess halls, scribbled it in notebooks, shared it like a prayer before takeoff. They called it the forbidden throttle. Some said it was madness. Others said it was salvation. Because with that one illegal modification, the P-51 Mustang, a propeller-driven plane of polished aluminum and human courage, could suddenly do the impossible. It could chase a jet, so when the Me-262s screamed over Germany, the world's first jet age had already begun. But thanks to a single mechanic's act of defiance, the Allies weren't left behind. The Mustang had found its second wind, and history was about to be rewritten in black smoke and contrails. This is the story of courage, rebellion, and a machine that refused to obey its masters. This is how a mechanic's forbidden throttle turned the P-51 Mustang into a jet killer. The winter of 1944 pressed down on Europe like a weight of lead. From the English coast to the ruined fields of France, the air trembled with the sound of engines. Every dawn, the horizon filled with silver wings, P-51 Mustangs, Spitfires, Thunderbolts, and the endless stream of bombers that lumbered east toward Germany. To the pilots, the sky had become both workplace and graveyard. Clouds no longer looked like clouds, but like camouflage for flak. The sun, when it rose, burned through smoke that never really cleared. For months, the Allied air forces had ruled the daylight. Their long-range Mustangs guarded the bombers all the way to Berlin, and the men believed the end of the war was only a matter of time. Then something new appeared in the distance. Small, dark shapes moving twice as fast as anything human hands had ever built. At first, they were rumors. German jets, they said, powered not by pistons, but by flame itself. Pilots scoffed until they saw one with their own eyes, a Messerschmitt Me-262, climbing almost straight up, leaving behind a shimmering heat trail. Its sound wasn't a roar. but a shriek. Thin and metallic, like tearing metal. Gunfire couldn't touch it. Turning to chase was useless. In a single pass, the Me-262 shredded bomber formations that had taken hours to assemble. Radio calls filled the air. "They're too fast! They're gone!" Followed by static. For the first time since 1940, Allied confidence cracked. The jet age had arrived, and it belonged to the enemy. Down on the airstrips, pilots stepped from their Mustangs, pale and silent. The P-51 was still the finest propeller fighter ever built. Graceful, balanced, deadly in the hands of an expert. But its very design was bound by the limits of air and fuel. Its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650-7 engine could sing only so high before tearing itself apart. Mechanics knew those limits by heart. 61 inches of manifold pressure for takeoff, 67 inches for war emergency. Anything beyond that was suicide. But as the bodies of friends stopped returning, the numbers on the dial began to feel less sacred. The men who flew the Mustangs weren't just fighting Germany anymore. They were fighting physics, fighting the clock, fighting despair. Each takeoff felt heavier than the last. Frost coated the wings, and the smell of high-octane fuel mixed with coffee and fear. Pilots tightened their gloves until their fingers went numb. Somewhere over the channel, they would meet the invisible hunters, the new jets, and they knew that courage alone couldn't close the gap. In mess halls that night, talk turned quiet. Some wondered if the Allies would have to build jets of their own before the war ended. Others prayed that someone, somewhere, would find a miracle hidden inside the old machines they already had. That miracle was coming, but not from a laboratory, nor from a general's order. It would come from the muddy hands of a single mechanic, a man who refused to believe that limits were absolute. While the world looked upward for salvation, he would look inward, into the heart of the Merlin engine, and change the course of the air war forever. War stories often glorify the men who fly, the aces with painted noses on their planes, the heroes who return with smoke trailing behind them, and victory claims written in chalk. But behind every flight stood a second army, the mechanics. They lived in the mud and noise, surrounded by the constant clatter of wrenches, compressors, and the cough of engines starting up in the cold. At the 357th Fighter Group's airfield in Leiston, England, these men worked 16-hour shifts under floodlights that made the frost look like ash. They weren't chasing glory. They were chasing reliability, a word that meant life to the men who flew. Among them was Sergeant Ernie Hollis, a quiet man from Ohio with permanent oil under his fingernails. Hollis had been a car mechanic before the war, tuning hot rods on dirt roads, learning how engines spoke through vibrations and smell. In the Army Air Forces, he carried that same instinct, that feel for when a machine wanted to do more than it was allowed to. The Merlin engine fascinated him. 6 banks of pistons, supercharged, precise, beautiful, yet leashed. The manuals warned about red lines and manifold pressures as though they were sacred laws. But to Hollis, every limit was only a suggestion written by a man who'd never watched a pilot burn. By late 1944, he'd seen too many empty bunks. He'd watched pilots go up in Mustangs that came back full of holes, or didn't come back at all. Each time he'd kneel by the wreckage, tracing his hand across melted aluminum and thinking, she had more in her. That thought haunted him. One night, when the others had turned in, he stayed behind in the hangar. Rain hammered the tin roof, and somewhere outside, distant guns echoed across the channel. Hollis lifted the cowling on a Merlin and stared at the throttle assembly, the governor, the mixture control, the boost regulator. He knew the design by heart. He also knew that if you bypassed the boost line and richened the mixture at full throttle, the engine could push far past its rated power. It would run hotter, harder, louder. It might even die. But for a short while, it would turn the Mustang into something new. Something faster, than any rule book allowed. It was a dangerous act of rebellion, done not out of arrogance but desperation. Hollis wasn't trying to break the engine. He was trying to save the men. He made his adjustments carefully, marking nothing down, cleaning his fingerprints from the tools. When the morning came, he briefed the pilot with quiet honesty. "Don't hold her there long. 10 seconds, maybe 20. She'll scream. You'll feel her pull like hell. Then back off, or she'll tear herself apart." The pilot, a young lieutenant barely 20, nodded and smiled nervously. That day, the modified Mustang took off into gray skies and disappeared over the channel. Hollis waited in silence, the stopwatch in his hand ticking louder than the airfield itself. If the plane came back, he'd know he was right. If it didn't, he'd carry that guilt forever. Either way, the war had just changed. Not by command, not by invention, but by the turn of a single wrench. The morning broke cold and wet over the Leiston airfield. A low fog clung to the ground, muffling the sounds of engines warming in the distance. Mechanics moved like shadows through the haze, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, calling out numbers that disappeared into the mist. In the middle of it all stood Captain Charles "Chuck" Yeager, his leather jacket zipped up to the neck, goggles hanging loose around his throat. He was young, but already carried himself like a man who'd seen too much sky. Hollis approached him quietly, wiping his hands on a rag blackened with oil. The two men didn't speak much. There was an unspoken understanding between pilots and mechanics. Each trusted the other with his life, and that was enough. Hollis finally broke the silence. "She's tuned different today," he said, nodding toward the P-51 sitting on the tarmac, its silver skin beaded with dew. Yeager raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Hollis hesitated, then said, "You'll feel it when you push her. Don't hold it too long." That was all. No explanation, no manual, no paperwork. The fewer people who knew, the safer they both were. Yeager gave a small grin, the kind that said he didn't need convincing. "If she blows, I'll glide her home," he said, then turned toward the cockpit. The Merlin engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life, a sound that echoed off the hangars like thunder. Hollis stepped back, feeling the vibration travel up through his boots. As the plane taxied to the end of the runway, the fog began to lift, revealing streaks of pale sunlight across the field. Yeager lined up, throttled forward. And then, something happened. The engine's tone changed. It wasn't the steady hum of a normal takeoff. It was a deep, furious growl that seemed to tear the air apart. The P-51 surged forward faster than anyone had ever seen, wheels lifting off almost instantly. Hollis felt his chest tighten. For a few seconds, he thought the plane would explode. But it didn't. It climbed, hard, steep, powerful, cutting through the fog like a knife. Up above, Yeager's grin widened. The airspeed indicator was climbing faster than it should, and the Mustang felt alive under his hands, twitching with energy. He eased the throttle further, and the RPM needle quivered deep in the red. The cockpit filled with the high-pitched scream of strain. Every instinct told him to back off, but curiosity was stronger. For 30 seconds, the plane became something else entirely. Raw, violent, magnificent. Then, with a practiced hand, he eased the power back down. The engine coughed, sputtered, and settled. The test was over. When he landed, the ground crew ran to meet him, their faces tight with expectation. Steam poured from the cowling, the smell of scorched oil filling the air. Yeager pulled off his gloves, climbed down, and looked straight at Hollis. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Yeager said simply, "It works." He paused, glancing back at the smoking Mustang. "But she's angry." Hollis nodded slowly, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Ain't we all?" he said. That day, word began to spread, quietly, carefully, through the fighter groups of the 8th Air Force. Pilots started asking strange questions about mixture settings, boost levels, and manifold pressures. They wanted to know about that thing Jaeger tried. The secret was out. A new kind of power had been born, not in a laboratory, but in the hands of a mechanic and a pilot who dared to ignore the rulebook. And somewhere above the gray clouds, the P-51 Mustang had found its new voice, a scream that even the German jets would one day learn to fear. By the end of that week, the secret had begun to move faster than the airplanes themselves. It didn't travel through memos or orders, it moved in whispers, passed between mechanics and pilots like contraband. In the smoky mess halls of East Anglia, over tin cups of bitter coffee, someone would lean close and say, "Did you hear about Jaeger's bird?" A few nodded. Others smiled without answering. They already knew. Across England's frozen airfields, men began testing their luck, turning screws one notch farther, pushing throttles 1 inch past the red line. It was never official, never written down, but the results spoke louder than regulations. Engines that once groaned to climb now howled skyward. Mustangs began catching glimpses of jets they'd only seen vanish before. The war, it seemed, was shifting again, not because of a new weapon, but because of a small rebellion hidden under the cowlings of old ones. Every squadron had its own name for the modification. The 357th called it the Hollis trick. The 4th Fighter Group dubbed it the Whisper Tune. Some joked it stood for Hail Mary Mode. Whatever they called it, they all knew it worked. Pilots scribbled notes on ration paper, tiny maps of mixture ratios, supercharger settings, and warnings like 20 seconds max or she'll melt. These papers passed from hand to hand, folded into flight gloves or stuffed into jacket pockets, the new scripture of desperate men. The air crews understood the danger. They knew the engines could seize, the coolant could boil off, and a single mistake could turn a fighter into a falling torch. But every one of them also knew what it meant to watch a German jet dive through their formation and slaughter bombers while they watched helplessly. Better to risk the fire than live with that helplessness again. Inspections grew tense. Officers wandered the hangars asking quiet questions about altered parts. Hollis and the others had learned to hide their work well. They smeared soot on the new welds, repainted the throttle housings, even filed the governor's seals to look untouched. Commanders turned a blind eye, at least the ones who cared more about victory than paperwork. They pretended not to notice when their squadron's kill ratios began to rise again. It was the kind of unofficial war everyone understood. Deniable, dangerous, but necessary. At night, when the flights returned, Hollis often stood at the edge of the runway, hands deep in his pockets, watching the lights approach through the fog. If he counted the right number of engines coming back, he'd allow himself a quiet breath. Sometimes a plane would land smoking, its Merlin knocking like a dying heart. The pilot would climb out, grin through the oil and soot, and say, "She made it." Hollis would nod, already thinking about how to make her ready again by morning. By December, the Mustang wasn't just a plane anymore. It was a promise. Word had spread across the channel and through the ranks. The P-51 could catch a jet now. Pilots stopped fearing the scream of the Me-262. They began hunting it. Somewhere between fear and faith, between science and instinct, a new confidence had taken hold. And though no medal would ever bear their names, it was the ground crews, the sleepless, shivering mechanics in oil-stained overalls, who had quietly rewritten the rules of aerial combat. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe's secret weapon was no longer a rumor. The Messerschmitt Me-262, Schwalbe, the Swallow, was now streaking across European skies in deadly flocks. To bomber crews, it looked like a silver ghost, appearing without warning and vanishing before a single gunner could swing his turret. The sound of its Jumo 004 turbojets was unlike anything they had ever heard. A high-pitched metallic wail that cut through the roar of propellers and wind. Each time the jets struck, the results were devastating. Bombers fell burning, parachutes blossomed against black smoke, and Allied pilots could only watch as their enemy climbed effortlessly out of reach. The P-51 Mustang had been built for endurance and grace, but the Me-262 represented a new kind of warfare, cold, mechanical, and terrifyingly fast. The first official encounter came near Hamburg in April 1945. Captain John Murphy of the 339th Fighter Group was leading a patrol at 25,000 feet when radar picked up movement, fast, erratic, climbing hard. Within seconds, a formation of Me-262s slashed through the bomber stream below, their 30mm cannons ripping apart two B-17s. Murphy caught a glimpse of their silver wings flashing in the sunlight. He banked hard, instinct overriding doubt, and jammed the throttle forward. The Merlin engine roared like a cornered animal. He could feel the plane tremble, the gauges screaming red warnings. Manifold pressure, 72 inches. RPM, off the scale. But he didn't care. Somewhere deep inside, the forbidden trick Hollis had shown him years ago came back to life. He held the boost, praying the engine wouldn't explode. Ahead of him, one of the Me-262s began a shallow climb, the pilot unaware that anyone could follow. But Murphy's Mustang wasn't ordinary. For the first time, a piston engine fighter was keeping pace with a jet. The air throbbed, the canopy shook, and the smell of burning oil filled the cockpit. Murphy lined up his shot, heart pounding, vision tunneling to the faint black cross on the enemy's tail. He fired. 650 caliber Browning M2s spat fire in unison, tracers arcing through the air like golden comets. For an instant, nothing happened. Then, impact. The left engine of the Me-262 erupted into a burst of flame and debris. The jet rolled violently, trailing smoke before plunging into the clouds below. Murphy pulled back, coughing in disbelief. He'd done the impossible. A Mustang had just killed a jet in level pursuit. When he landed, his plane was shaking, the engine temperature deep in the danger zone, but it was still running. The ground crew cheered, but Hollis, now stationed at another field, would have understood the look in Murphy's eyes. Victory came at a cost. Every time a pilot pushed the forbidden throttle, he was gambling with fate. The Merlin could take it for 30 seconds, maybe 40. But after that, something had to give. Cylinders cracked, valves melted, entire engines tore themselves apart mid-flight. Yet the men kept doing it, again and again, because now they knew it worked. From that day forward, the Me-262 was no longer untouchable. German pilots, once arrogant in their speed, began to look over their shoulders. They called the new American tactic the mad chase. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. The age of the jet had dawned. But the Mustang, born of pistons and courage, refused to fade quietly. It had found a way to fight back, powered by defiance, forged in fire, and guided by the hands of a mechanic who never followed the rules. For every story of triumph in the skies, there were half a dozen of smoke and silence. The forbidden throttle gave the P-51's claws sharp enough to scratch a jet, but it also demanded sacrifices measured in melted pistons and broken bones. Pilots called it riding the devil's heartbeat. They knew that once they shoved the lever past the gate, time itself shortened. 10 seconds of power could cost them an engine. 20 could cost them their lives. Sergeant Ernie Hollis understood that better than anyone. His days blurred into endless cycles of fixing what his own invention destroyed. He'd watch a Mustang limp home, trailing a column of gray, coolant hissing out through holes the size of coins. He'd run toward it before the propeller even stopped, waving away fire crews, listening to the tick of metal cooling down from red heat. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's face was often gray with exhaustion, gloved hands shaking from adrenaline. "She held," they'd whisper. Hollis would nod but say nothing. He could smell the scorched oil, see the blistered paint, and feel the guilt settling like dust on his shoulders. Every victory came stamped with his fingerprints. There was Lieutenant Harris, who tried the trick too soon after takeoff. The mixture was rich, the air thick, and the boost climbed faster than he expected. Somewhere over Berlin, his Merlin screamed once, then seized solid. The prop froze like a crucifix in front of him. He glided 20 miles, praying for open fields, but bailed out into snow and silence. He survived, but his Mustang burned to ash. Hollis heard about it the next morning from the crew chief. No accusation, just weary eyes that said, "We all knew this could happen." That night, Hollis sat alone in the hangar, staring at a governor spring between his fingers. He could still hear Harris's engine dying in his imagination, a metallic scream fading into the dark. Yet even after each loss, no one asked him to stop. The pilots kept coming, asking for that little tune-up. They spoke about how the jets were slower in turns, how the Mustang could still win if only it had a few more seconds of climb. They weren't reckless men. They were desperate professionals trying to stay alive in a sky that no longer obeyed their rules. Hollis learned to balance the settings like a priest handling relics. Enough boost to give hope, not enough to guarantee death. He started etching tiny marks on the throttle quadrants, invisible except under flashlight, reminders of how far a man could go before the edge. Outside, the war rolled toward its brutal conclusion. Airfields filled with wrecks that had flown too hard for too long. Engines lined up like corpses, each one a monument to the line between genius and madness. But still, at dawn, another P-51 would start up, coughing into life, the mechanic's hand resting on its warm flank for a moment too long, as if apologizing. The forbidden throttle had saved lives and taken them. It had turned machines into monsters and men into legends. And for those who worked in its shadow, it had changed the meaning of victory itself. In the end, survival was no longer about who flew best. It was about who dared to burn brightest before the light went out. By April 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing, but the fighting in the air was still furious. Every morning, Allied bombers lifted off from English bases, in waves so vast the ground shook under their weight. Above them, like loyal shepherds, the Mustangs circled and escorted, silver wings gleaming in the cold sun. The Germans, desperate and starving for fuel, threw up whatever they had left. Me-262s, FW-190 Doris, even ancient BF-109s running on synthetic gasoline. But the jet pilots, once so confident, now flew with a shadow of fear. They knew that somewhere up there, the prop planes were no longer the easy prey they'd once been. The whispers had spread. The Mustangs had changed. The transformation became undeniable on April 13, 1945, during an interception near Augsburg. Major William "Bill" Shomo, flying a recon-modified P-51 nicknamed the Flying Undertaker, spotted a flight of Me-262s attempting to take off from a forward base. The jets were slow and vulnerable on the runway, their engines still spooling up. Shomo pushed his throttle forward past the detent, feeling the familiar, dangerous surge of forbidden power. The Merlin howled as if alive, the prop biting into the air with murderous intent. In seconds, he was diving almost vertically, his guns flashing like lightning. The first jet exploded before it even left the ground, the second veering into the trees. A third tried to claw upward, but Shomo's Mustang caught it mid-climb and tore it apart in a storm of tracers. It was over in less than a minute. 3 jets destroyed by 1 propeller-driven fighter. News of that mission spread faster than any communique. For the first time, the Allied Air Command acknowledged in whispers what every mechanic already knew. The Mustangs were punching above their generation. Squadrons began coordinating jet ambushes, loitering high over enemy runways, waiting for Me-262s to land or take off. They had learned that while the German jets were unbeatable in open flight, they were clumsy when low and slow. The forbidden throttle became their equalizer, their secret ace card. Each time a Mustang screamed into a dive at impossible speed, the men on the ground felt the balance of air power tilt a little further toward the Allies. Hollis, still stationed in England, received letters from returning pilots. Some were simple notes. It worked. She caught one. Others came smeared with oil or blood. He read every one, folded them neatly, and tucked them into his toolbox. He never boasted, never confessed. To him, it wasn't about pride, it was about redemption. He'd seen too much death to mistake survival for glory. But when he heard the radio reports of jets being downed by Mustangs, he allowed himself a rare smile. Somewhere, the machine he'd defied orders to change was helping end the war. By May, Allied control of the skies was absolute. The Luftwaffe, out of fuel and out of time, was breaking apart. Historians would later write that Germany lost the air war because of logistics, radar, or numbers. But the men who were there knew another truth. The tide had turned because ordinary men had stopped asking permission. Mechanics, pilots, dreamers, all pushing beyond the red lines that others had drawn. The Mustang, born from discipline, had been reborn through defiance, and in that defiance, the Allies found their victory. When the guns finally stopped, the airfields fell eerily quiet. The men who had lived for years beneath the thunder of engines now found the silence almost unbearable. It was May 1945, and victory in Europe had been declared. Across England and the continent, bombers and fighters stood abandoned on their dispersal pads like sleeping beasts. Rain gathered in the tire tracks, and wind rattled the loose tin of hangar roofs. For the first time, no one shouted orders. There were no engines coughing to life before dawn, no smell of fuel thickening the morning air. The war that had consumed their youth had simply stopped. Ernie Hollis stayed behind as squadrons disbanded and pilots shipped home. He watched them pack their duffel bags and climb onto trucks, their laughter forced and uncertain. The same men who had once strutted across the flight line now walked with a strange quietness, as if they didn't quite believe they had survived. The airbase itself seemed to exhale. The mud dried, the tools were packed away, and the great Merlin engines cooled for the last time. Hollis wandered between rows of Mustangs, each one streaked with soot and patched with field repairs. Their names were still painted under the canopies: Sky Bitch, Passionate Patsy, Little Rebel, Miss Dallas. Beneath those names were ghosts. He stopped at one plane that had never flown again after its last mission. Its prop was bent, its cowling dented, but the paint still gleamed faintly where it read, Mary Ann. Hollis ran his hand along the metal, cold under his fingers. Every rivet, every scuff mark carried a memory. He could still see the young pilot climbing in for his first combat flight, nervous grin, trembling hands, and the empty sky when he didn't come back. The engine inside had been one of the first he'd modified. The forbidden throttle had given it wings beyond its limits, but it had also taken the man who flew it too close to the edge. Standing there, Hollis realized that machines remember, even when men forget. The papers called it the triumph of Allied engineering. They printed photographs of smiling aces, of polished planes gleaming under victory banners. But Hollis knew that history would never mention the ones who worked in the shadows. The men who bent the rules, who dirtied their hands so that others might fly a little faster, climb a little higher, live a little longer. He didn't need medals or parades. His proof lay in the silence of the hangar, in the smell of oil and metal that would never quite wash off his skin. Years later, when visitors came to see the restored P-51s in museums, they marveled at the beauty of the design, the grace of the lines, the legend of the Mustang. They never saw the hidden scratches near the throttle quadrant, the faint etch marks left by mechanics like Hollis. Those marks were not decoration. They were warnings, prayers, signatures of defiance. They told a story that couldn't fit on a placard, and so, as the last daylight faded over the abandoned runway, Hollis pulled a small, blackened piece of metal from his pocket, a fragment of a broken governor spring. He turned it in his hand, listening to the wind sweeping through the empty hangar. For a long time he just stood there, letting the silence settle. Then he smiled faintly and whispered, "You did good, girl." The war was over, but the sound of that Merlin, its scream, its courage, its rebellion, would echo in his memory for the rest of his life. In the years that followed, the world moved on. New wars brewed, new machines rose, and the skies filled with the scream of turbines instead of the thrum of pistons. Yet buried within the early blueprints of the jet age was a shadow of Hollis's defiance, a lesson learned not from laboratories, but from muddy airfields and sleepless nights. The men who had worked on the Mustang's Merlin engine carried their experience into a new world of aviation, one powered by speed, pressure, and danger. Many of them would go on to work for companies like North American Aviation, Lockheed, and Boeing, where they designed the very engines that would define the future. They remembered how the Merlin could be coaxed beyond its limits and built their new turbines to survive the same kind of abuse. The idea that a machine could give more if you had the courage to ask it became an unspoken principle of American engineering. In 1947, when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1, journalists hailed him as a pioneer of modern flight. Few mentioned that he had once been a Mustang pilot, one of the first to test Hollis's modification. When asked years later what prepared him to face the unknown, Yeager smiled and said, "Flying the P-51 taught us what the red line really means. It's just paint." Beneath that simple joke lay the truth. Those reckless, desperate experiments over Germany had shaped an entire generation of aviators. They learned that limits were not walls, but warnings, that courage sometimes meant trusting your instincts more than your instruments. Meanwhile, the U.S. Air Force quietly classified and buried any reports of the boost mod. Official histories mentioned it only in passing, labeling it a field adjustment or temporary power enhancement. There were no medals for Hollis, no commendations for the ground crews who had risked court-martial by rewriting the laws of engine safety. Their work lived on only through whispers among pilots, through old flight logs scrawled with strange annotations, numbers that didn't match the manuals, power readings that defied factory design. The truth survived in the margins, like a ghost in the machine. Decades later, when museums began restoring wartime aircraft, mechanics sometimes found small anomalies buried deep within the throttles of surviving Mustangs. Tiny filed-down stops, modified screws, hand-cut fuel lines. Most restorers dismissed them as field repairs, never realizing they were holding the physical remnants of a revolution. In the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum, one P-51D bears a discreet engraving under its cowling. For Ernie. No one knows who etched it there or when, but among aviation historians, it has become a quiet legend. Some say it was Yeager himself. Others believe it was one of the men Hollis taught, leaving a tribute where no general would ever see it. The legacy of that forbidden throttle was not just speed, it was spirit. It proved that innovation is often born from disobedience, that progress sometimes requires breaking the rules written by cautious men. The Mustang's defiance carried forward into the F-86 Sabre, into the SR-71 Blackbird, and into every pilot who ever looked at a warning light and thought, just a little more. The world forgot Hollis's name, but every time an aircraft pushes past what's expected, somewhere in that sound of rising power lives his memory. A whisper of the day, a mechanic dared to challenge the impossible. The years passed, and the war that had once defined them faded into textbooks and museum displays. The airfields where men like Hollis worked became farmland again, their runways cracked by grass and time. Children rode bicycles across the same tarmac where Mustangs once thundered into battle. The smell of oil and cordite had long since disappeared. But sometimes, on still evenings, When the wind shifted just right, locals swore they could hear it again, the distant hum of a Merlin engine circling unseen above the clouds. In 1951, at an air show in Ohio, the crowd watched as a restored P-51D Mustang taxied onto the runway, polished aluminum glinting like liquid silver in the sun. The announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, recounting the legend of the plane that had escorted bombers to Berlin, the machine that won back the skies. But the man watching from the edge of the field didn't need the reminder. Ernie Hollis, older now, hair gone gray, stood with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. The noise, the smell, the vibration, they all came flooding back. When the pilot opened the throttle and the engine screamed, Hollis flinched instinctively. He could tell, even from the sound, that it was tuned differently. It was factory perfect, cautious, civilized, safe. And yet, beneath that controlled hum, he thought he could almost hear something else. His old trick, the ghost of forbidden power waiting to be set free. As the plane lifted off, its shadow swept over the crowd like a memory reborn. Hollis watched it climb, looping through the afternoon sky with the same grace it had shown over Europe decades earlier. For a few moments, it wasn't just a performance, it was a resurrection. He closed his eyes and saw again the faces of the pilots who had trusted him, the wrecks he'd mended, the nights when he'd bent the rules because doing so felt like hope. He thought of Harris, of Murphy, of Yeager's grin that day on the foggy runway. They were all up there, somewhere beyond the clouds, carried on the echo of a sound that once changed the course of a war. When the Mustang landed, the crowd cheered and cameras flashed, but Hollis stayed still. The world had moved on to jets, rockets, and the edge of space. Yet he knew that every one of those machines, every leap of engineering and courage, owed a small debt to the reckless souls who dared to push too far. What began as a mechanic's disobedience had become the foundation of a philosophy. That progress is born not from obedience, but from audacity. As the air show ended and the engines fell silent, Hollis turned to leave. He took one last look at the plane as mechanics wheeled it back to the hangar. In its polished skin, he saw his own reflection, older, weathered, but proud. "You did good, girl," he whispered, just as he had on that last day of the war. Then he smiled and walked away. The sound of the Merlin fading into memory. The camera would linger on that empty runway, the wind stirring a forgotten flight log, the screen slowly shifting to black and white. A soft narrator's voice would rise. Some legends are not born from glory, but from defiance. This was one of them. Fade to black. Text on screen. Dedicated to the ground crews of the 8th Air Force. The war may have ended, but the stories still fly. Subscribe for more untold stories of courage, invention, and the machines that shaped history.